There is a lot of nonsense out there. Oftentimes, when people talk about J.R. Tolkien, they will talk about him in terms of like, he's a hack. He's a literary hack. He doesn't know how to get into the head of the characters. He does not know how to write good pacing. His world building is way too overdone. It's way too overbloated. There's just a lot of criticism thrown at J.R. Tolkien, and a lot of people say that he's overhyped and that he's famous because he was a forefather or to the fantasy genre. Essentially, he came first, therefore he's famous. And I think this is a nonsensical claim. I think this is complete BS. In fact, this infuriates me, and so much so that I decided to make this video of why J.R.R. Tolkien is not a hack, and why he's not overhyped or overrated, and why he deserves every bit of praise and acclaim that is thrown his way. So the claim goes, the first one is that he was celebrated because he was a forthcomer, and that he's not a literary, he doesn't have literary prowess. Okay, so there's a lot of literary devices out there. So for example, what is literary prowess? What is someone's ability to do literary? It's someone's ability to tell a story using a philosophical concept and see how that particular story, or at least how that particular idea or philosophical concept is not just expressed in the story, but also in the characters. Now, one of the literary ways that you can tell a story is using a literary device, essentially an excuse to explore a literary subject. In this particular story, The Lord of the Rings, especially the Fellowship of the Ring, you essentially have the one ring, the ring to rule them all. It's a literary device, right? It's a MacGuffin, it's a magical artifact, it's a magical object, and it is what the characters are after. So if you pay attention to it, what is the accomplishments of the ring? The ring essentially is the literary device to explore the literary subject, which is power and how power corrupts people. And you can see power in many ways. You can see it in terms of health with Bilbo. You can see it in terms of wealth. You can see it in terms of actual raw militaristic power. The list just goes on. However, the ring essentially is the literary device where all of these struggles for power stem from. So that is one aspect of literary prowess. In other words, use a literary device to sort of affect the world and to enable the exploration of the literary subject. But on top of that, this ring goes a step further. It actually affects the characters. It corrupts the characters. In other words, the ring is actually used to enable character arcs. You have Gollum, who has been given a negative character arc, who has been essentially corrupted by power, and this obsession with power, essentially the ring, through many years, and he has become internally unrecognizable. Who he is has been completely eroded, but on top of that, he has also become physically, unrecognizable. Why not? It's a fantasy story, so you can really do that. You can't often do that in the real world. So if you pay attention here, this is one of the powers of the fantasy genre. Essentially, the fantasy enables the literary. J.R. Tolkien happens to have recognized this, and J.R. Tolkien happens to have used this, okay? It's very crucial to understand he happens to have recognized this, and he happens to have used this. So furthermore, you have like Boromir, who has been completely corrupted. The desire for power, it played on his fears. The ring plays on his fears, essentially, for his people. And he wants better for his people, but he needs this power, okay? He needs this power from the ring. And so he essentially gets corrupted by the ring. You have other characters like Saruman. You have essentially other people who have been given also corrupted, like Bilbo. The list just goes on. There are so many characters in The Lord of the Rings, and essentially all of those characters are given character arcs, or they are tested by the literary device, which is the ring. The ring is brilliant, and it is a genius move. It's so simple, yet it's so effective. And the fools will oftentimes underlook or overlook this. So he's not celebrated because he was a forefather, or because, he came first. He is literally celebrated because he is a literary genius. He was capable of using the fantasy in order to help him tell his literary story. This is something that, Shakespeare used to do. This is something that essentially most of the literary giants throughout history have done. This is what mythology has always done. And this is what J.R. Tolkien happens to do, and he happens to do it phenomenally. And he happens to do it so well that it seems, or it looks to an outside observer, seamless. It looks easy. Get the ring or invent a magical artifact and then just use it to tell a literary story. Wrong, because so many authors throughout history have tried to replicate J.R. Tolkien and so many of them have failed. Take a look at, for example, Wizard's First Rule, the Sword of Truth. There are so many magical artifacts in that particular story, but none of them mean shit, okay? None of them are ever used as well and as seamlessly and as skillfully as J.R. Tolkien, okay? The fantasy is a power that you can use to explore literary, okay? And J.R. Tolkien happens to do that. Therefore, he's a literary genius. He's not a literary hack because he happens to have dwarves or elves, or he happens to have, eagles that are insanely large, or he happens to have dragons or, wizards and so on and so forth. No, he's a literary genius because he is literally a literary genius. Another criticism that is thrown his way is that he was not capable of delving into the head of his characters. False. Completely wrong. He was actually always capable of delving into the head of his characters. Look at Bilbo. It's a very early example, and you have Bilbo actually desiring to want the ring back. First of all, to do that, you have to delve into the head of the character. Why? Because you see, this man is rich, wealthy, he has had stability for so long. He was in a comfort zone for so long, and he was effectively, from the perspective of, someone who is a hobbit, he has outlived so many people, and all of it is thanks to the ring. Now, if you examine that, you can come across this fear of death, okay? You can come across health, longevity, youth, and these are topics that you have to collectively understand. In other words, delve into the head of this character in order for you to actually write a scene where he has this slight negative arc, okay? You can take a look at, Boromir, as I mentioned before. This is a man who's delving into the head of his characters and examining their fears and what they are scared of and what, tugs at the heart and so on and so forth. He's not a vapid, empty author. You just have to read and observe and be slightly more attentive. Because if you do that, you will come across how in so many different places and in so many different occasions, he will delve into the fears of the characters, into the wants of the characters, into the desires of the characters. And he will also understand what they need, okay? Because a need is something good for the character, but their flaw leads them to overlook that, okay? And so it is crucial to understand these things. It is very, very crucial to understand them. So he is not someone who is incapable of delving into the head of his characters. He was perfectly capable of doing that. Another thing that I really like to comment and point out here is how he had this ability to be very original, okay? What is originality? Okay, I'm not talking about 100% original because Tolkien was not, and I doubt that any author in human history has been completely 100% original. Originality in the way we talk about it essentially is take something familiar and sprinkle in something unfamiliar, okay? Most of the story is familiar, but there is an unfamiliar part about it. Now, that can be any number of things. It can be visual, it can be in terms of storycraft, it can be human, it can be behavior, it can be magic, it can be anything. Now, when you take a look at The Lord of the Rings, for instance, his magnum opus, it takes a lot of influence from Norse mythology. It combines that with, a world that is being built, okay? In other words, like fairy tales, okay? And on top of that, it combines that with the familiar plot beats of the mentor and the apprentice. And all of these things together happen to really be a very beautiful, unique cocktail. They happen to be a very beautiful, unique mix of things that have not been really completely put together up to that point. And you can see it was so unique and so effective that essentially it became the benchmark for what fantasy was for essentially the rest of the 1990s. But the first individual who used the number 0 was unique. It does not matter, or the fact that, 0 is very common in our world does not take away from the reality that, when an individual said that for the first time, it was a very unique endeavor, okay? The same thing with algebraic expressions. X plus 1 equals 5. Therefore, x equals 4. Something like that. These are, simple equations that were extremely unique for someone to have solved at the time. Today, it's alphabetic for an engineer or engineering student or anyone in the STEM field, right? So it does not take away from the fact that they are very unique. It does not take away from the fact that they are very unique. You take a look at most modern fantasy authors. They don't have as many elements about their stories that are as unique as this one, as J.R. Tolkien or as The Lord of the Rings. So a lot of the criticisms that are lauded at J.R. Tolkien, I find them to be vapid. I find them to be nonsense. I think he's a literary genius. I think he can happily and easily delve into the head of characters. And I think he is, unlike most authors that we have today, he's very unique, okay? So there you go. I hope that you enjoyed this. Tell me what you think about J.R. Tolkien. Do you like him? Do you hate him? I hope you enjoyed this. Have a nice day. Bye.